Hello, folks, and welcome back to World War II TV and our France at War week. And we are tackling subjects that specifically involve the French military. Today, less of that, more of the fact we are talking about France as the battleground where the action took place. And I hope you joined us yesterday for the Bir Hakeim show, and I hope you'll be joining us again for the other shows we've got coming up this week. But today, we're focusing on the events of 1940. Now, the reality is, when people think of 1940, there's two kind of bookends to the what they know about. It's kind of the fall of France and Dunkirk, and then the Battle of Britain that follows. And we had, of course, Battle of Britain on World War II TV back in September. But in between those kind of events, you have the air battle that took place in France. And let's be honest, it's been a bit overshadowed by these two other events. So to talk about it, Dr. Matthew Powell is a teacher of all this kind of stuff, tactical air doctrine, air power history to the RAF and other places. So I've got an expert top guest for you. So Dr. Matthew Powell, good evening. How are you doing today?
Hi, Paul. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I am very well. So, I think I kind of summed it up there. The actual air battle in France is rather overshadowed by those other events that precede it and follow it. And is it something that you think should be studied, not just because of its historical importance, but also because of the lessons learned there?
I think so. There's a lot that comes out, particularly for the RAF, in terms of what they learn for tactical air power development going into the Second World War, how to communicate between air and ground, the best way of doing that, the best tactics to use. So it's really something that leads into it. But also, I think, building on what you said about it, focusing on Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain, we also see a reputational damage to the RAF in terms of Dunkirk and the fact that they're known by the British Army as the Royal Absent Force, because they're flying way past the British forces and the French forces on the Dunkirk beaches in order to try and protect them and act as an interdiction force rather than a close air support force. But also we can see how it leads into the Battle of Britain with Dowding and his refusal to send more squadrons of fighters into France when they can see that the battle's pretty much lost. And so it has a direct consequence into the Battle of Britain and that husbanding of resources that we see that's so vital for fighter command in the Battle of Britain as well.
And we will be talking about resources because it's that era of the war where we haven't got enough of anything really anywhere, and then have even less of it after Battle of France. But before we get into that, I just, I've talked about the fact you teach this for a job, but where did your interest in the RAF start? Was it always in the RAF? Was it always the Commando comics with the Spitfires on the cover that drew your interest, or was it the focus on the aviation something that you grew into later?
I guess like most air power historians, it started really with the Airfix models, doing things like the Spitfire, the Lancaster, things like that, and that got me interested in it. And then I was lucky enough to get a place at the University of Salford to do it as an undergraduate degree, to look at military history more general, and the air power side of things really struck me. And sort of the topic of the talk and the wider topic of the book that I'd published a few years ago all came from my master's dissertation, where I was looking for something to do and went and looked at tactical air power in France in 1940 and its subsequent development. And then came across lots of references in the archives to Army Cooperation Command and thought it might be quite important that I'd find a book or two on this. Very little had been written on it. One book had been published in 2014 on it by David Ian Hall, which is an excellent book on the topic. And the only other one before that was in 1943, and that was an 11-page almost pamphlet. And so that was the perfect avenue for me to go into a PhD and to look at Army Cooperation Command. And for that, I had to go back to the First World War through the interwar period and into the Battle of France to get an understanding of the developments that are made in late 1940 and onwards in Britain. Well, where did they start? How did they come to these ideas? So that's really where it all started, was sort of a fresh-faced 18-year-old with a lot more hair.
Oh, we all know that. Yeah. We all suffer the same affliction. It's the brain power. It's the brain power pushes out the hair. That's what it must be. And the thing is, you touched on it there yourself, that there is this enduring idea of the Air Force being absent on the beaches of Dunkirk, which, as a Normandy historian, we get the same thing there. You speak to Tommies and GIs in the battle, so they were never there, and you kind of, because they were 20 miles beyond you, knocking out reinforcements coming towards you. But you can only, as a veteran, you can only appreciate what's happening around you. And because of the focus on the beaches, the focus on the guys on the mole at Dunkirk, and their vision of the events of April, May, June 1940 have kind of overshadowed other people's involvement. I mean, we're talking about the Royal Air Force, but we could equally be talking about the Royal Navy in this period, because their role, apart from the little ships, which isn't really the Royal Navy, gets kind of overshadowed all the stuff going on elsewhere in the bigger picture. So anyway, we're going off into a discussion of historiography right now, but let's focus on what we're talking about. So you've come with a PowerPoint, not stacks of images to confuse you tonight, folks, just some kind of basic stuff there. But what we'll do is I'll hand over to Dr. Matthew Powell in a minute, and then folks, if you've got questions, if you've got some comments during the show, we can address them as we're going along, or we can do some questions at the end as well. But over to you, Matthew. We'll kind of talk about the RAF and the Battle of France.
Thank you, Paul. So I think, as Paul has alluded to quite well there, the RAF have been overlooked, and air power largely has been overlooked from the Allied side, at least from the German side. Perhaps the understanding that we have of German air power is slightly misunderstood in terms of how they apply air power. But really, as every historian will tell you, in order to understand what happens at the point of the topic or the point of the talk, we really have to go back in time to sort of understand how the RAF performed, the problems that it has. And so really we go back to 1st of April 1918 with the creation of the independent RAF, much against the wishes of the Army and the Royal Navy, particularly once the war ends in November 1918, where they believe that really they should go back to a Royal Flying Corps, Royal Naval Air Service type of structure where they control the air power. They have operational control over what happens. Lloyd George says to Winston Churchill, I'll give you either Secretary of State or the Admiralty or the War Office, but whichever one you choose, you have to take the RAF with you. And it was assumed that that would be the death knell of an independent RAF, that it would be rolled up as a wartime expediency, and we go back to the good old days of pre-1914, and the two senior services having that control over what was happening. That doesn't happen. Winston Churchill is a firm believer in air power, believe it or not, at this point. So he works hard with the person on the left of the screen here, Sir Hugh Trenchard, who's technically not the first Chief of the Air Staff, and certainly not the father of the Royal Air Force, as some people may think. That really comes down to Sir Frederick Sykes, who's really the first Chief of the Air Staff, but is forced to resign and given a role as head of civil aviation in the UK. Now, Trenchard faces an exceptionally difficult period in sort of the time 1919 to 1923, 1924, where the Royal Navy are trying to have them disbanded. And having gone through the documents that are available at the National Archives at Kew, this is a particularly brutal battle that's being fought here. The Navy are really trying their best to have the RAF disbanded, and it boxes Trenchard into a corner. The Army are not particularly happy either in terms of an independent RAF. They believe they're not going to get the right form of air support they want, when they want it, and how they want it. And so they're also pushing back against this. So we can see a sort of degree of small c conservatism emerging here from the two senior services against this upstart little service that's essentially amalgamated the Army and the Navy's ranks to create their own rank structure. There's a lot of criticism of the RAF. They lack culture, they lack heritage, they lack prestige. They shouldn't really exist in the minds of the sort of the senior officers of the Army and the Navy. And Trenchard has got really two options when he takes control of the RAF in terms of the monies that he's given to be able to spend. He can spend them on new aircraft, but with an aircraft lasting roughly 5 years on average in service, he's going to be spending good money after bad to renew these aircraft. Or he can build foundations that can be built on in times of need. And that's what he does with the money. So he sets up a technical training college down at Halton, RAF Halton, where the apprentices are trained. He sets up an officer training college at Cranwell, which is where I currently teach and teach the commissioning officers coming through. And he also sets up his own RAF staff college, where he can start to indoctrinate people into air power. Now, in order to defend themselves against the attacks from the RAF and from the Army and the Royal Navy, Trenchard becomes a convert to strategic air power. He doesn't believe it's an expedient use of air power in the First World War. It should be used to support ground forces. Once we come to his time as Chief of the Air Staff, what we really see is that he's flipped 180 degrees, and he starts to emphasize strategic bombing as a way of trying to end wars quickly. His ideas are similar to those of Giulio Due, the Italian air power theorist. Not quite as extreme, but if you read between the lines of what Trenchard is saying, he's essentially advocating attacking civilians through attacking industry and attacking what he calls morale. And Trenchard comes up with a very interesting concept, which is if you have a physical effect that is 1, you will have a greater moral effect. And at times this is 5 to 1, 10 to 1, 20 to 1. It really depends what mood he's in and who he's talking to as to what number this is. And he's been described by certain air power historians as the master of the unfounded statistic. There's no proof of this at all. The other way that he tries to keep the RAF in being is to emphasize air defense and defense from airspace, something that really the Navy and the Army aren't going to be conducting. Now, from the research I've conducted, that's not to say that they neglect tactical air power, but it's certainly not high on their list of priorities in terms of air power development or what they're going to look for the Royal Air Force to do in any major future war. But what I have found interesting from the archives are a series of Army cooperation reports where inter-brigade and inter-division exercises were conducted between 1927 and 1933, where they practice with the Army and they practice close air support techniques and find that they're quite dangerous, as they also found in the First World War. So the RAF think we don't really want to do that. And so another argument starts to emerge in the mid to late 1930s about what form of air support should the British Army be getting. And for the British Army, it's very much close air support. We want aircraft on call when we want them to be able to come in, and we radio them in, hear the coordinates, drop your bombs. That's what they want to see. For the RAF, they see the higher level of war, the operational level of war, and the use of battlefield air interdiction, sealing off the battlefield through attacking communications, transport links, reserves, local command and control headquarters, munitions dumps, all these sorts of things that are not going to have an immediate effect on the battle itself, but will actually be able to provide a higher level effect by enabling the Army to gain more in the longer term relative to what they might get through close air support. The other problem that the RAF faces...
For a second there, I just wanted to comment on the fact, Matthew, that already, and I'm not knocking our wonderful viewers there, conversations have already started about the ferry battle and Spitfire and Hurricanes and is that, from your point of view, and looking at the archives and what you've done with your book, and by the way, folks, the link to buy Matthew's book is in the description below, as always, but has there been too much of a focus by people on the individual aircraft types in this period and comparing, it's the top trumps we talk about, and they look at what Italy are doing or what Germany are doing or what Britain are doing, so, well, that's better than that and that shouldn't be doing, and maybe there's not been enough focus on the setting up of, you said yourself, of the infrastructure, the doctrine, the systems are more interesting of how the RAF is going, because as you said, in peacetime, you spend money on aircraft, it's out of date 3 years later. What's the point? So would you agree that there's been a bit too much focus on the aircraft types, not on the structure behind it?
To a certain degree, I think so. And if you look through the majority of bookshops on the high street, Waterstones, etc., and you go to the air power section, there's very little looking at structure, development, ideas. But you will get the Spitfire, the Lancaster, various volumes on all of that. So I think to a large degree, there has been a bit more of a focus. I mean, obviously, an Air Force is only as good as the aircraft that it's got. And that sort of is another interesting point in terms of the development and the generational changes for the RAF. We talked about the ferry battle. Well, that started to be developed in the early 1930s, around about 1932-33. It rolls off the production line in its first batch production in 1936. It's already obsolete and out of date. But the RAF are faced with the difficulty of, do you keep the aircraft industry producing aircraft to keep the labour, to keep the experience, to keep them open, and accept that you're going to get aircraft that are possibly out of date and obsolete? or do you cut the orders and wait for the next generation of aircraft? The Lancaster for the Bomber Command is the best example of that, to come through. And so it's a really difficult decision for the RAF to make there as to what you do. And I think they actually come down on the right side of the decision on this one by keeping the aircraft industry going and accepting that you're going to get obsolete aircraft coming through, rather than really, telling the aircraft industries to stop, losing the workers, losing the experience, and having to restart production all over again. But I think, I think for air power especially, you do get that sort of rivet and bolt and engine horsepower type of history that comes through. And that's interesting in and of itself, but we've got to put it in that wider context of, so what? What does it mean for how these aircraft are going to be?
And the ultimate problem that is in the 20s and 30s and even into the 40s is that do you allow the weapons you have at the moment to dictate your doctrine and your approach, or do you try and set the approach and the doctrine first and fit the aircraft and tanks you have to that? And there's no right answer to that, is there?
No,
it's kind of a bit of moving both things forward, kind of alternately, to try and push everything forward. There's no point having, it's like when we talk about a football analogy, there's no point asking National League players to try and play the same system Barcelona plays, because they're perhaps not as technically gifted. But at the same time, you want to have some kind of structure to the way you go about fielding an 11 men on the pitch. So the same thing would apply in basic level to how you're going to win an air battle. It's that, are we going to fit, what do we fit in first, the structure or the aircraft?
Absolutely. And it's a huge problem that even today militaries facing when they come to procurement. And I think today, even more so than in the 1930s, when money was being pumped into defense, it's the idea of what's leading this process. Is it the doctrine and you're saying, right, we need these aircraft to do this? Or are you saying, okay, we can get these aircraft, how do we use them?
Yeah.
And it's a difficult question to answer. And with the evolution of aircraft in this period, you move from the wooden aircraft of the First World War very quickly in the late 20s to the metal aircraft with retractable undercarriages, variable pitch propellers, enclosed cockpits with oxygen and things like that. You're almost seeing a revolution in the aircraft that you're using, and having to learn how to use them all over again as they did in the First World War. And so I think it's almost impossible to get right, especially if you're reacting to somebody else, as the British are doing when it comes to Germany. Germany are leading the way in the mid to late 1930s in all of this. And the British have to react to what's happening. And they face certain issues in terms of they can't compel industry like you can under a dictatorship.
Yeah.
They're having to keep finance and make sure Britain's got strong credit so it can still import the raw materials it needs to build the aircraft. So it's having to face a lot of challenges alongside things such as industrial reorganization and getting access to skilled labor. The aircraft factories are built in places where there's very little skilled labor. And even if it is skilled metalwork labor that you can get, it's usually not suited to working in the light alloys that you find in the aircraft of the late 30s in all of this. So it is.
That's I never thought that's a really good point about the labor force as well. And, and this, how aviation is still very much in its infancy. It's kind of a 1-2 generations since it even started as a concept. Now when you're teaching RAF history as you do now, there's 100 years of flying now. Back then it was 20 or 30 years of flying, which is a very, very different situation. You haven't got that legacy of here's how we did it before, because here's how we did it before didn't really exist. I mean, yes, there's aviation in the First World War, as you said there, but it's very much secondary to everything else in the First World War. So it's the Second World War is where aviation becomes, as we know, the war winner that it potentially had the potential to become.
Yeah, and then that's
anyway. I've let you go off on a tangent there. I will go back to your presentation. I kind of went off down a rabbit hole there, which is not the first time I've done that.
It always happens. We find that with whatever we do, especially in the archives, you find something really interesting and follow the trail as far as you can. So what we see, one of the problems the RAF has in the late 30s is that the British government of the day decide or don't decide what they're going to do with the British Expeditionary Force. Are they going to send it to France? Are they not? And they finally make that decision in 1938. And so all of a sudden, the RAF have got to change and turn on a sixpence to now think about supporting the British Expeditionary Force when it moves to France. It's only 6 divisions, which isn't a huge force to support, but it means a radical change in thinking in all of this. And eventually up to 1939, the RAF win out on the argument. The army still aren't particularly happy with what's agreed, but the army agree to go to war in 1939 with the ideas of the Royal Air Force at the fore. So it'll be battlefield air interdiction over that of close air support as the priority for the RAF when they come to support the British Expeditionary Force when the Germans attack in 1940. So to give a little bit of context here, and one of the ironies, I think, of the Battle of France in 1940 is that they managed to achieve in 6 weeks with defeating the French army and defeating France and conquering the territory and taking over the government there effectively. What they wanted to do in 1914, the Schlieffen Plan is designed to knock the French army out in 6 weeks, and it is unsuccessful. They get pushed back at the Battle of the Marne in September 1914. The German General Staff and Hitler as well, to a certain degree, in 1940, think that this is going to be a similar campaign to that of the First World War. It's going to be attritional in nature. It's going to take 2 or 3 years to defeat the French and the British in 1940. And as I said, the irony is that they managed to achieve what the German army of 1914 couldn't, and knock the French out in 6 weeks.
With essentially the same plan. I mean, not quite, but you know, it's not dissimilar, is it really? The 40 plan to 14.
There's one major difference in the two plans. The Germans still plan to sweep through Belgium and Holland this time. They decided not to go through Holland in 1914. They thought it was politically inexpedient to do so. But in fact, what we see in 1940 is that the Germans are going to go with essentially the Schlieffen Plan of 1914 up until an incident in mid-1940, around about early 1940, where a German officer with the plans for invasion is at a drinks party in Germany, and he needs to get back to Berlin, so he's going to leave early. He gets talking to a few people there, and it turns out that one of them at the party happens to be a Luftwaffe pilot who offers him a ride home in his plane. So up they go in their aircraft. They're flying along, bad weather, heavy cloud, and they get lost, and they don't know where they are. And once they get below the clouds and they can see where they are, they think they're still in Germany, so they do an emergency crash landing, only to find out that they've landed in Belgium. They quickly get arrested by the local gendarmerie, taken to a local police station where obviously these documents are taken from them and seem to be quite sensitive and quite important. And so the German officer that was carrying these plans and knows that he's really going to be in for it when he gets back to Germany, tries to throw them in the fire in the police station to destroy them, and in doing so badly burns his arm. So those documents, even the charred remains, are enough to be sent to French intelligence for them to understand the German intentions if they were to invade France, that they're going to sweep through Belgium, that they're going to sweep through Holland, and that they start building their plan and their thinking around that. This gets fed back right through the German command system, all the way up to Hitler, who has a conversation with Erich von Manstein, who comes up with a slightly different plan that we can see in the 1940 map, that they will still sweep through the Low Countries as a diversion in order to be able to draw the French and the British into battle and to hold them there, but that they will now sweep through the Ardennes forest and cross the river Meuse around Sedan, Meuse and Dinant. The French, quite surprisingly, actually believe that the Ardennes is impassable to heavily armoured formations, particularly the panzer formations of the Germans, despite the fact they did an exercise in 1937 showing it to actually be quite easy to do and that it wouldn't cause too many issues. So the French are already starting to make some mistakes here. They also make a big mistake in terms of their doctrine. They're very much on the defensive. They want to be able to sit behind the Maginot Line and just draw the Germans in and destroy them through the fortresses and the Maginot Line. The problem with the Maginot Line is that it's incomplete, and it stops around the River Meuse, where the Germans are planning to attack. So the Germans have already got the upper hand here in terms of the planning stage of the operations. For the British and the French, they've got two variations of a plan. The one is to advance as far as the Escaut River, called Plan E, where they will sit and use the river as a defensive fortification and again try and draw the Germans in. And obviously, this is a lot about the land aspect, but without the land moving, the air can't support in what they want to do. The other plan is Plan D, which they eventually go with, which is to advance as far as the Dial Plan. Now, this is complicated because in 1936, the Belgian king, King Albert, decides to declare his country neutral. So he leaves the alliances that have been signed with the French and the British, which means that those forces have to sit on the French border until they get notification of a German attack. So they're always going to be slow in what's happening. They're always going to be one step behind what the Germans are doing in all of this because they're essentially reacting. Most of 1940 for your average rank and file infantryman is an exceptionally boring time. The Americans call it the Sitzkrieg. The British call it the Phony War. It's not a particularly pleasant experience for those stationed on the ground. It's one of the coldest winters known for a lifetime in 1939, 1940. There's not a lot of training that's happening. There's not a lot of anything for the troops to do. They're not being well looked after. The French morale is dropping quite quickly and quite drastically in all of this. And so you have to really ask, are they really in any position to take on this battle? Are they really a willing force to do it? They're conscripted. They've had a year's training, which for an infantryman isn't a huge amount. You can really get them to march up and down in a straight line and perhaps shoot relatively accurately, but you're not going to get a huge amount out of these troops in all of this. So that's to set the context before we actually get into the fighting. The other thing that really causes problems for the British and the French in all of this is that there are a lot of false warnings about a German invasion throughout 1939 and 1940. And it essentially then becomes the boy that cried wolf. They're not really, anytime a warning comes out, they don't really take it seriously. And so again, reaction times are slowed. And when we come to the actual fighting on the ground in France, speed is of the essence in all of this.
But well, thank you for that context there about the ground forces there. But the phony war is a bit of a misnomer anyway, because we know the Navy are far from doing nothing, and that there are other things happening, other parts of the world. The Japanese and Chinese are at it, and but what are the RAF doing at this point?
The RAF Bomber Command are conducting daylight raids over German military targets, naval ports, military institutions. They're trying to attack industrial factories. And what they're finding from Bomber Command, at least, is that they lack the range, the ability to carry enough ammunition, but also the sheer danger of carrying out daylight raids without fighter escorts. So they're getting mauled in the sky in terms of Bomber Command. Fighter Command and other aspects of the RAF are sent over into France. They moved fairly quickly, actually, in September 1939. And we have a real difficulty in terms of command structure. And it may be something that most people don't think about. The difficulties of command structure and having a clear command structure is really, really important. Who are you reporting to? Who's giving you your orders? Can somebody override you? Who's got operational control? And we can see on the left here, this is the command structure that's set up in 1939 in September. So we've got the Royal Air Force that's sent over. We've got the Advanced Air Striking Force, which is essentially going to be an extension of Bomber Command, which at this time is under Charles Portal, who's on the in the middle at the bottom there. So he will have control over the Advanced Air Striking Force. They're going to be used to attack targets in Germany, mostly armed with the Fairy Battle. Above Portal, we've got the British Expeditionary Force Commander, Lord Gort. So we have the RAF being split into two parts here. We have the Advanced Air Striking Force, but also the RAF component of the BEF that's going to provide the support. That's under the operational control in September 1939, right up until the end of 39, of the British Expeditionary Force. The Army has operational control. This is something that Trenchard has said throughout the interwar period shouldn't be happening. It should be an airman that has operational control.
So why was that decision made? Why was it not their own control then? Whose decision was that?
That was the decision of the cabinet as to who would have operational control.
Bloody politicians, eh? What do they know about anything?
Absolutely, yeah. So that's a decision made by cabinet. It's also a chance to give the RAF, the British Expeditionary Force, that feeling that they've got control over their own support from the air, that they will be able to direct it as they want. But it's found that this command structure, even in the relative peace of 1939, 1940 in France, it just doesn't function. It's too haphazard. It's too confused. Nobody really knows what's going on. So they reorganize the RAF and they turn it into the British Air Forces in France in 1940. So we now see a different one. We see the control of Advanced Air Striking Force given over to the person on the bottom right, Air Marshal Sir Arthur Ugly Barrett. And having looked at many photos of him, because he goes on to become Commander-in-Chief of Army Cooperation Command, I think he's well deserving of his nickname. But I think it's used in the spirit in which it was attended, because most of his letters are signed Yours Ugly, which I find really interesting going through the archives. And then he also gains control over the RAF components. So the RAF then get that control that they need in order to sort out this command structure. It's not brilliant. The Army in particular really don't like losing this operational control of their forces. The one anomaly in the command structure, and that the person on the top right is General Georges, who's head of the French forces under General Gamelin, who's Commander-in-Chief. Barrett doesn't sit under the French. He's an independent commander. He can make his own decisions, whereas Lord Gore, as the British Expeditionary Force commander, is subordinate to the French. So again, we still have a confused command structure here in the fact that the RAF can essentially do what they want. They will talk to the French and ask the French and work alongside them, but there's no direct command or control over what the British Air Forces in France are going to do, whereas Lord Gore is very much stuck in that command chain. And so again, it causes confusion as to what's happening. The other thing I think to say about the structure and the headquarters, as I talked about the Army cooperation exercises, co-locating your headquarters, this is something that I've seen repeated throughout air-land integration since the First World War, that it's often forgotten. And what we see is that the British Expeditionary Force and British Air Forces in France actually have their headquarters about 100 miles apart. So there's no way of communicating directly with people and actually sitting down and talking to them. I think after the experience most have had over the last 18 months, if you're going to have serious discussions and you can put plans into place, yes, we might have the technology to do it over the internet and do it by video conference today. But really, you need to be in the same room with these people to understand what's going on, to get the body language, to make sure you're on the same page. So both sides of the British forces, the air and the land on this, they really, really struggle to communicate with each other. And so it's confused, it's difficult, it's haphazard. It's the best, I think, that could be done at the time, given that they're in a war and any major command changes are just going to cause even more disruption.
Also, if I may just play devil's advocate for a moment there, clearly in your profession, you've now got 100 years of RAF history to look back on, and you can see that at even within World War II, but then we have the other wars that followed, you can see clearly there are better systems of improved ground, army, aircraft. This is the first time, though, isn't it? I mean, the First World War we can kind of discount because you said the Royal Flying Corps was so small, so less a part of it there. The interwar period is great, but there's no actual action. Okay, the Spanish Civil War maybe could have given us some clues here and there, but this is the first time there has been any needs to have any kind of combined force out in the field. So you've got to start with something so that you can then see what the flaws with it are. And I guess when we get towards the end of the presentation, We can touch on, for example, the Dowding system in the Battle of Britain, some of which the lessons there can have been taken forward from this area. But you have to start with something, and just because we can see flaws in it now, having compared it to other later systems, doesn't mean that at the time they could recognize in advance it had flaws. Does that make sense?
It does. I think you, as an air power historian, I feel duty bound to defend the Royal Flying Corps here.
Okay.
They do an awful lot. They're small, they're not very big, and the aircraft they've got allow them not to have a huge impact on the First World War. But the doctrinal issues and the structural issues that they come up with, such as put your headquarters together, they found that if they put artillery officers and the spotters in the air living together, the ability of the spotters went up exponentially. Once a new unit came in on either side who didn't know each other, that dropped off. So that idea of community, of working together, but it's something in terms of co-location, we can see it. The Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, the Falklands, Gulf War. We even see it as late as Operation Anaconda in Afghanistan in 2004, where the headquarters weren't even on the same continent, let alone in the same country. And the air-land integration system falls apart. So this is something that's always struck me in all of this, that it's such a simple concept that put headquarters together, put people together. It doesn't work. People don't remember it, and they don't do it. But it should be something that's second nature. I think the RAF and the Army are starting to work together a bit better today, but I still don't think it's to the point you would want it to be in all of this. This is where we get to this idea of joint headquarters, and it's something that's developed by Barrett essentially on his own, the Allied Central Air Bureau. And essentially, this is the key to good air-land integration. It's a clearing station, forward headquarters made up of joint staff, Army and RAF working together. So they will receive calls from the front line requesting support, and they will be able to, once the system is developed after the Battle of France in 1940, be able to communicate back to the soldiers on the front line. This is something that's not available at the time, but it's certainly something that they look at afterwards, and we'll get more into that when we look at the lessons learned from the BEF and the RAF in that. But this is the key, communication, getting the information in, sifting it. Where are the priorities? Where do we need to provide this support? So we have the Allied Central Air Bureau that provides that. It's essentially, as I said, a forward headquarters to get the requests for support in. It doesn't function effectively well because it's not supported by either the BEF or British Air Forces in France fully. The BEF aren't willing to put their resources into it. The RAF put what resources they can into it, but they're understaffed, undermanned. And so they struggle to put it together. But as a concept, they can see how it might function, how it might improve reaction times. And when we come to look at the sort of the next slide, when we look at the German attack on the Meuse, what we see is the Germans are particularly effective and efficient at providing support to their ground forces. Now, I think there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that the Luftwaffe is a very relatively late developer in terms of becoming an independent air force, and it is independent of the army, but it's very much told your job is to do this. We also have the idea of geopolitics, that Germany is surrounded by a lot of land borders. Any war that it's going to fight is largely going to be on the ground. Therefore, it needs to be able to act quickly and provide support for its ground forces. It can develop a fleet of strategic bombers. But if we flip the tables of the Battle of France and the Germans get knocked out in 6 weeks, what's the point of those strategic bombers? They wouldn't have had the chance to have had an effect. One of the reasons why the British can go down the strategic bombing route is because they're protected as an island. So they don't have to worry about that. So they neglect that to a certain degree. The Germans, as you say, in the Spanish Civil War, start to perfect the techniques of what's happening. But one of the, I think, the misnomers and the myths that come out of the Battle of France from the German perspective is this idea of the Luftwaffe being a close air support force, and that's really all they do. And that's actually not the case. What we see in all of this is that they are a very good interdiction force. They knock out French and British air assets on the ground. They fight them in the air for control of the air. But instead of trying to get theatre-wide control of the air, all they're really looking to gain is control of the air over what they call the Schwerpunkt, the point of operations, the decisive point that they want to attack and put their resources into. And so after the invasion of France on the 10th of May 1940, the first couple of days, the Luftwaffe don't provide really any support to the ground forces as they're advancing. They're ahead of them, providing that interdiction, sealing off the battlefield, and gaining that localized control of the air. Now, I think one of the biggest ironies of the Battle of France from the Allied perspective is that the Ardennes, whilst it's passable, does cause huge traffic jams of tanks and transport vehicles. And RAF reconnaissance actually overflies the Ardennes forest and sees this trailing back all the way past the German border. So it's these columns are spotted. Barrett goes to General Gamelin, goes to General Georges, and says, "This is what our reconnaissance has found. We would like your permission to attack them." So he's still got to get tacit permission from the French, despite being nominally independent. And these two commanders refuse that permission. So in the first couple of days, we see a chance here for the Allies to have turned the tide and really cut German advance off at the head and caused all manner of problems for them by stopping them dead in their tracks. The French are exceptionally fearful of any revenge attacks on their towns and cities and their population being targeted. So they're reluctant to allow this to happen. So when the Germans reach the River Meuse at Sedan, this is really where the Stuka comes into its own. It's got air control of the air. It's able to exploit the air as much as it would like. There's a little bit of contest from the Spitfires and from French fighters, but not to a huge degree. They've got the sky. They can use it as they want. And the Stuka is armed with a psychological weapon called the Horns of Jericho. And if you've ever watched a video of the Stuka, and you can hear the noise that it's making, that's these sirens that the wind is rushing through, blaring out at them. And if you look at Alistair Horn's The Battle of France 1940, he has some sort of first-hand reports from the French soldiers who were under attack at Sedan. And they were cowering in 1/2 meter deep slit trenches at this point. And they said the bombs were raining all around you, and it felt like every single one of them was meant for you. And so it was a pretty horrific incident. The French are caught off guard at Sedan as well, because they have the 55th Infantry Division stationed there, which is a third-rate conscript division of slightly older, slightly unfit personnel that are put there because it's meant to be a quiet sector. The timing's also very bad for them in that the artillery formations are changing over as well, so they lack artillery support. So there's no real contest then, nothing to stop the Stukas doing what they want. Guderian, who's head of the column, head of the panzer group that's advancing, when he gets to the Meuse and gets the inflatable dinghies out to cross the Meuse, his troops won't cross. They simply won't. It's too dangerous an operation as far as they're concerned. So as a leading commander, he leads from the front. He gets in the first dinghy, grabs some reluctant volunteers and starts paddling across to get across the river. So we can start to see here that German bravery and leadership and the willingness to take the risks and to show his troops how to do things. I said about that myth about the Luftwaffe as a close air support force. Yes, they do conduct close air support at Sedan. They do it effectively, and it allows them to establish a bridgehead from the sort of the 12th of May onwards, which they can build bridges over, and they can sweep through France as they do, stopping at around Dunkirk in a few weeks' time. But the other crossings of the river at Namur and Dinant are actually achieved without any close air support whatsoever. They managed to cross the river without air support. So it's somewhat of a myth, I think. If you watch something like The World of War, or if you read some popular histories, you'll get this idea of the Luftwaffe as a close air support force and nothing more. And it's a lot more complex than that. So that's from the German aspect. For the British in all of this, they're drawn into the River Dial in Belgium. They're providing reasonable support to British and French forces. They're not doing too bad a job, but that's because the Germans aren't really contesting too much. They know that if they can draw them in, they can sweep and outflank the French and British forces and essentially trap them against the North Sea coast. So if you move on to the next slide and we look at the counter-attack that happens, and this is really, I think, the main tactical action that the British Air Forces in France conduct in all of this. The French and the British are very much caught off guard. They think that the attack in the Ardennes and across the Meuse is a diversion to draw them away from Belgium for the Germans to be able to sweep in. So they really don't pay a lot of attention until around about the 14th of May. So this is 2 full days for the Germans to establish themselves, get across. And what we see is that the RAF and the French Air Force get together and decide, right, we've got to try and blow up these bridges. We've got to try and stop them crossing. So at least if we can stop their supplies, we have a fighting chance in all of this. Because this is so vital to the Germans and their ability to get across the river, it's one of the few crossing points that's left because most of the other bridges have actually been destroyed prior to the German attack, or at least when the Germans initially attacked. They're going to protect this like their lives depend on it, and it really does for the success of the operation. So what we see is that Barrett decides to organise a counterattack of RAF aircraft, the Fairy Battle, which is slow, badly armed, cumbersome. It's not going to do a huge amount of damage, but something has to be done. And this is really the only option that they've got in all of this. So the morning of the 15th of May, it's agreed the evening before that the British will do the attack in the morning. The French will conduct the attack in the afternoon. The British attack. They send their aircraft over. Not hugely successful, but casualties are within reasonable rates. Most of the aircraft come back home, just about, mostly through luck and partly skill in the pilots and the ability, just the sheer determination to get back. When it comes to the afternoon attacks, however, the French are in such chaos politically, militarily, that they can't get the aircraft together to conduct the attack. So this means the initiative then falls back on the British Air Forces in France and back onto Barrett to have to organise this attack. Now, the Germans are probably expecting another attack, and they're fully prepared for an attack in the afternoon, given the importance of the sector. And so Barrett travels to the squadrons and speaks to all of the pilots that were on duty for that afternoon and says to them, this is a volunteer mission only. You do not have to go on this mission if you do not want to. And I think it's testament to the fortitude and the bravery of the RAF pilots on duty that afternoon that none of them shied away. They all stepped forward to carry out that mission. The mission, I think it's fair to say, is almost a complete disaster. Those that aren't mauled by the waiting ME-109s or the anti-aircraft artillery that have been set up around the Sedan to protect it, and then mauled on the way back. I think out of 10 or 12 squadrons that were sent on the attack, 1.5, maybe 2 come back in total. And I think, we often look at senior commanders, and if we look back to the First World War, we look at someone like General Haig as being quite cold and callous about what he was doing when he was organising attacks, and his reputation has taken a big knock because of it, and it's probably not reflective of academic study of the First World War the last 30 years. This decision almost gives Barrett a nervous breakdown, knowing that he's essentially sending men on a suicide mission and that they won't be coming back. And so I think that really highlights the pressures and the stress and the strain that's put on senior commanders, that these aren't unfeeling people. They do understand what they're doing, but given the dire situation that you're in, what other option have we got? We haven't got any other aircraft that we can send to try and attack this. I've done my best to save people as I can by offering it as a volunteer mission only. So I think it highlights the sort of what it's like for senior command. We often think about those at lower command at the coalface of the battle, but we often, I think, neglect that senior command and sort of the decisions that they're having to make.
The study of 1940, I think we're left with this idea that no one at a higher level really cares. It's all kind of politics and And yeah, there's a bit of a kind of hangover from the First World. I think you're right on that. I think we think of some of the French generals and some of the bit as being a little bit kind of maneuvering their figures on maps rather than actually caring in a kind of a hands-on way about their people. But so you talked about a few minutes ago about the French not allowing them the permission to go and kind of strike in the Ardennes, and now there's this. They are doing something 2 days later, but it's not a very large force. They're on a voluntary basis. But in your study, we can touch on this later if you prefer. But in your study of this, with the resources the RAF had on the ground, in the air, there, what should they have done better at this point? Was there anything else they could do better, or were they always kind of fighting one arm tied behind their back because of the political complicated system that exists between the British and the French, and the diplomatic side of things that's going on, the politics that's going on behind? But if they could have sorted out the politics, what more could the RAF have done at this point?
I think at this point, for me at least, I know some historians would probably disagree with me, but I think once the Germans break through Sedan and they start to advance, I think that's it. That's game up for the French. They can't maneuver their forces quickly enough. Their command system is one that is hierarchical in nature. It's not a mission command approach where you can give freedom to subordinates. This goes all the way up the chain of command, all the way down. And you talk about sort of generals and perhaps being backwards. General Gamelin is a perfect example of someone who hasn't kept up with the times. He's in a chateau as his general headquarters somewhere outside Paris. He hasn't got a telephone. He doesn't believe in this newfangled technology of a telephone. So he can't communicate with people effectively. And so what we find is that the tactical pace and speed of the Germans is just out thinking and out pacing the French, what we might term today the OODA loop, the observe, orientate, decide and act. They're well inside that. And so the French will send orders down. Here's the map. Here's a stop line. This is where we'll hold the Germans. By the time it's gone up the chain of command and back down the chain of command, the Germans are well past that point.
Yeah, it came up in the sidebar earlier, Matthew, about the fact the French don't have radios. They're using, some of them are using telephones, some aren't, and they're using runners. And it always kind of annoys me a little bit when Guderian gets talked about, the German general, as being a tank guy, because to me, he's a signals guy who understands tanks. It's the signals experience he has and the communications experience that makes him good at what he does. And the tanks are his tools, but his ability comes from understanding communications. And I guess in your studying of the RAF, there, not that when the show isn't about the Luftwaffe in 1940, although we could do that in the future, the Luftwaffe and its cooperation with the army is clearly functioning at a slightly better level than the RAF and the French cooperation is at this point of the war. So.
Yeah, and when it comes to this, it's the speed of response of getting the information back from the front line to a decision maker and then acting on that decision. And for the RAF, the average time from a request for close air support to it being answered with aircraft arriving is on average 2.5 to 3 hours. And that's just not quick enough. So that's something they certainly could have done, I think, is to improve the speed of their communication and decision making. But I think at this point, you're almost just rolling the dice and hope you get lucky and that you might be able to stop them and then see what you do. Once the Germans advance through France, the French and the British struggle to organize themselves to form a major counter-attack. So you have isolated counter-attacks in the flanks. But this is also where the Luftwaffe come into their own again. As the Germans advance, they start to outpace their support, their artillery support. And they have open flanks, and any military or land commander will tell you the one thing that they always fear is an open flank.
Yeah,
you don't want open flanks because they're vulnerable. So the Luftwaffe act as flank supports. They act as protection to that, and so they can pick off or they can give the reconnaissance information to ground commanders to prepare them for what they're doing. So the Luftwaffe, again, it's shown itself to be much more than a simple fly over the troops and drop bombs on people kind of air force. It's much more sophisticated than that. To go back to the counterattack, this is really where we start to see the RAF start to retreat. They start to sort of leave as quickly as possible. But what we see once they get back to the UK and they're operating from the UK and they have a better signal system in operation and they can communicate more easily, their time for air support, it drops rapidly to half an hour, 45 minutes. again, we talked about Dunkirk at the very start, and I was debating whether or not to put this in or not. But I think, again, it points to something that I'll highlight in the last slide when we look at the lessons learned. We see lots of troops on the beaches, and the Royal Absent Force makes its appearance very often. They're not seen in the skies, therefore they can't be there. They're not helping us. We're getting bombed by the Germans. The RAF, again, are trying to have that operational level effect in all of this. And so they won't be seen by ground forces, but that highlights, I think, the different horizons that land and air have. Land can see what's in front of them, and if they're not getting the support, they're going to moan about it. Yeah. Air can see much further because of the range of the aircraft, even in 1940. And so it becomes a lot more difficult. The RAF are, in fact, at the beaches of Dunkirk, and they do an awful lot to try and stop the Luftwaffe attacking the troops on the beaches. But it's a difficult task. It's essentially trying to do what they do in the Battle of Britain without the advance warning that the Dowding system gives. Yeah, you're patrolling the skies looking for aircraft, and if you're lucky, you might find one. But
no radar, no observer corps, no central communication strategy. All the things that, as we know about, we talked about in the Battle of Britain week that we relied on. They haven't got here. And then of course you add the shortened flying time because they're flying over the channel, and again it's asking a lot of people.
So I think to a degree the complaints of the forces that are getting bombed are justified in that they are suffering these attacks and they want to know where the air force is. And I think we can almost go back to Blackadder goes forth and where are our air forces he's carrying under the table before Flashart lands in the trenches. But they are there. But I think what you said at the start is key here, that it's coloured our view of the RAF, it's coloured our view of the Battle of France. But I think also Churchill has coloured our view of Dunkirk and trying to spin what is an humiliation, really, into a positive, into a victory. Now, that's vital, I think, at the time for the morale of the population to try and spin it that way. But I wouldn't necessarily trust many of Churchill's writings on the Second World War because I think he puts himself rather at the forefront.
Yes, I think we all agree on that. Yeah, I mean, and I know we're going to touch on it in a minute when you come to do your lessons learned, but I think even the RAF personnel who are there flying in France, if they survive the Battle of France, they're then going to be taking part almost certainly in the Battle of Britain, which is several months of flying. If they make it through that and they start thinking about putting memoirs down at that point, what they've experienced the Battle of France would seem so far in the past. So many things that have been bigger, seemingly more important have happened since then. That's not helped the cause of understand the Battle of France, because there's been that much less written about it than there was later things. I mean, look at people like Johnny Johnson, who went all the way. He was talking much more about the stuff that happened towards the end of the war because it was in his recent memory. It makes absolute sense that if you'd made it all the way through to 1945, the events of May 1940 would have seemed a lifetime ago. How many different aircraft types have you moved through? How many squadrons have you rebuilt and reformed in that time? Of course, the lessons of this era kind of get dropped. And of course, as we said at the beginning, the Dunkirk narrative, for reasons that we know, Alan Allport, we talked about that back in the popular Battle of Britain popular memory, the idea of the nation being at this crossroads and the Battle of Britain defining the British spirit, the Blitz spirit. All of that has led to this air battle being just falling through the cracks, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think because it's also the British aren't heavily involved either, so we don't pay an awful lot of attention to it. Really, we don't even give it as a contextual build-up to the Battle of Britain, apart from maybe a half a chapter in most books on the Battle of Britain. We don't really talk about France an awful lot until we get to 1944. And perhaps that's another reason we have the Battle of France and then another Battle of France in 44. So, there's a lot to that. And I think your point about Johnny Johnson and the care we have to take with memoirs and first-hand accounts of people as historians is really important in this. We can't just take them at face value and this is how it was. That's one person's experience amongst many. They've got a very limited scope as to what they can see. How far is their memory being coloured by what they've read, seen, and spoken to people about afterwards? I always remember as an undergraduate, being told about a couple of journalists who interviewed 20 Vietnam veterans about their experience in Vietnam, and 2 historians found this book really interesting. Let's do some digging on these people. 10 of them had never served in the American army, let alone ever gone to Vietnam. So how many people that you speak to are actually never there and are just making things up? And so there's a lot in first-hand accounts that, as historians, we really have to be careful of. They can be useful, certainly, but they've got to be used with a degree of caution, I think.
I mean, that we're going down a potential rabbit hole, but yeah, yes. Speaking to RAF veterans they tend to have, fighter pilots tend to have this mystique about them. They're great storytellers. They draw you in. They have you spellbound. Jeffrey Wellham, those kind of last few guys we had in the last few years, spellbinding personalities. But actually, as you said there, the real hard graft of a historian is going through those archives and thumbing through page after page of Air Ministry directive here, squadron orders there. That's where you find, in some ways, the real the meat of the history there, and then you add the color of the personal accounts to kind of to make your accounts readable and interesting. But yeah, it's all about the hard data there. But so we'll kind of conclude things with the lessons learned, and then I'd like to talk a bit more about why we should be talking about this battle more. So but over to you for the lessons.
So the people we've got left from right here on the left is General William Bartholomew, who conducts a report that's available in the National Archives, and the cabinet references see it into my memory. I've used it that often. In the middle is Sir Cyril Newell, the Chief of the Air Staff. He's shortly to be replaced by Portal in around about September, October 1940. And on the right, we have Ugly Barrett. Now, Bartholomew conducts an investigation on behalf of the War Office to discover what went wrong in France for the British Expeditionary Force. He calls many army officers in. He only calls one air officer in. A little bit of background on Bartholomew. He's due to be Chief of the Imperial General Staff in 1936. But he's shipped off to India because he causes that much trouble with the independent RAF, because he hates an independent RAF as an idea in being, and he also hates joint service solutions. So is he the best person to be put in charge of this investigation? It depends on what result you want to get out of it, I think, and he certainly finds the right results for the army. So the army, he has many failings with the army. The report is available in the archives for those who want to see it. I do discuss it in depth in the book as well. One of the things that he says that I found rather strange was that if the British had faced the Germans on their own terms, they would have been victorious. I would have hoped that would be the case. If you can't meet the enemy on your own terms and win, then I think you've got fundamental issues in all of this. But he's heavily critical of the RAF, and I don't think that's unexpected given his attitude towards an independent RAF. And we see certain misunderstandings come out of the Bartholomew report for how the army understands air power at this time. So they agree that control of the air is vital, that you should gain it, but their understanding of control of the air is a defensive force of fighters as an umbrella protecting ground forces, not the dynamic contesting control of the air to exploit it that the RAF have got. So we've got here same language, different meanings being used, which causes confusion. Talk about sort of the Royal Absence Force. That certainly comes through in the Bartholomew report, where he says the RAF must fly the flag, no matter, above all missions, control of the air included. Ground forces must see their air force in front of them. They must see them in the sky to raise morale. It doesn't matter if they get shot out of the sky, according to Bartholomew. They must be there to fly the flag. And also that the army should have its own army air corps and should have operational control over aircraft. And that causes, creates all sorts of problems if you investigate it in terms of where do you find the space in industry? Do the army really know what they're doing with this? How are they going to train the pilots? Who's going to pay for it? But he starts pushing that idea, and it's an idea that isn't really quashed in Britain until mid-1943 with the creation of 2nd Tactical Air Force. So it's a debate and an argument that's had between people like Barrett, Bartholomew, Alan Brooke. Throughout most of the Second World War, they're arguing over who's got control over the aircraft. From the RAF perspective, their report is a lot different. If you read it again, go into it heavily and analyze it heavily in the book. Barrett comes out and says, okay, yeah, we lost. We were badly beaten. We accept that. So for a start, they're willing to accept that they got this wrong. But with things like the Allied Central Air Bureau, they are really starting to see, okay, we've got a concept here that can work. And the key to all of this is communication. If we can get communication functioning and get that information back and forth to people, we can have an effective air support system that we can essentially transplant to different theatres and map and modify. And so prior to the creation of Army Cooperation Command on the 1st of December 1940, what we see are some exercises conducted in Northern Ireland between an airman, Woodall, AA1 and JD Woodall, and a British Army officer who's in Barrett's joint headquarters. They get a Lysander. It doesn't matter what the aircraft is. They're conducting communications trials, and they come up with a way of creating several clearing stations that can, each clearing station can communicate with 4 or 5 units on the front line. And they come up with a pro forma sheet that they can send through wireless telegraphy back to this clearing station. But the key in this is that it's two-way. So they can go back to each unit and say, sorry, your request for air support hasn't been successful. You need to find another way. Yours has. And that's the key. That's the real key to all of this. And part of that idea gets developed in the Western Desert on its own, but also part of it is taken directly from the work that's done by Army Cooperation Command in setting up this air support system. And that's pretty much it, I think.
I mean, so we'll do some questioning. But so summarizing, basically the Army is saying it hasn't worked, so they kind of want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, whereas the RAF are saying, no, we are saying, yeah, we are agreeing it hasn't worked, but there is some fundamental structural ideas here that will work if we amend them, improve on them, and build on them. And that, I guess, is what you're saying is the foundation for the eventual developments we get in North Africa and Conningham and all those kind of people, and those real fathers of that combined arms approach to using air power as part of an overall scheme. So the RAF voice obviously wasn't heard at the time. The Army voice seemed clearly got more of an audience.
I think so, because of sort of the nature of the retreat and the evacuation. The Army is going to get much more of a hearing here, and this really provides the perfect political opportunity for the Army to put the boot into the RAF and really try and get their own way on air support, as they've been trying to do in the interwar period. And the pressure the RAF feel about this is that they feel they have to set up this Army Cooperation Command, something that the Army can go to. This is where you go to for air support. If you want to develop it, if you want to use it, go to these people. Don't talk to us. This is what you want to do. So they put real pressure on. They really, like I said, really put the boot in and take advantage of this opportunity. So even in defeat and relative failure for the British Expeditionary Force, it's a chance for them to try and get something out of this. And it's something, as I said, that Brooke, in particular, as Chief of the Imperial General Staff, really tries to take advantage of and really force the issue on Porter when he becomes Chief of the Air Staff after Newell in September, October 1940.
And just thinking about the fact as well, with the numbers of infantrymen and army, the engineers who were evacuated from the beaches, and they're going to be given leave. Some of them, they're going to be home. They're going to be chatting in pubs. I mean, they can't. So the bloody Air Force weren't there. Whereas if you're RAF and you get out of France, you're kind of back into ops pretty much immediately, aren't you? I mean, and there's less of them in the first place, and so you can understand within the country this kind of idea that somehow the Army had been let down by the Royal Air Force, because that was kind of what people were saying. And you get the same in Normandy with the amount of veterans I've met. It's, there was no bloody air power, and you try and explain to them what the air power was actually doing. Oh, well, I never saw that. So, well, you shouldn't have been seeing that. It was happening 30 miles beyond where you were, But the fact is, you were facing 2 Tiger tanks that day, not the 6 it could have been if 4 hadn't been knocked out on the way up, or rather, had not the fuel bowsers or so-and-so been knocked out on the way up. It was still shit for you, but it could have been a hell of a lot more shit had the Air Force not been doing their job there. But we've got a couple of questions. The main question, the recurring theme that's been in the sidebar, is Spitfires in France, Matthew. So why they weren't there? Some of them, they did do some operations from the UK, but that if you want us to sum up your feeling about Spitfires in France, that has been the overriding obsession by the viewers today.
There were a fair few number of squadrons of Spitfires sent out, some of them for reconnaissance, some of them to try and gain control of the air. So a lot of the operations that they're conducting around the Dial and in Belgium to try and gain control of the air there, to try and push the Germans back and sort of enact the Dial plan in all of that. But I think the real importance of fighters in general for the RAF in all of this is Dowding and the request from the French military and the French politicians that they send, and I think it's 4 or 5 extra squadrons to France to provide the support. This is questioned heavily by Dowding. Churchill's keen to send them. He wants to keep this relationship going and keep the French as happy as possible, despite the difficulties that they're facing militarily. Dowding refuses to send these over. And the memo that he writes has often been referred to as the most famous memo or most important memo of the RAF's history. And as Ian has said in the comment there, that he's getting concerned over the losses, and he's starting to think about what this might mean if France is defeated for the defence of British airspace. And so he refuses permission to send these squadrons. I think he sends 1 or 2 squadrons over, but that's his absolute limit on all of this. He won't send any more because he realises that the next battle coming up is going to be that air superiority battle that comes to the fore in the Battle of Britain. So the Spitfires and Hurricanes are there. They are contesting air superiority, but they're just in the wrong place, really, in terms of where they're fighting for it. They're not fighting for it over the River Meuse around the Ardennes. They're fighting for it in Belgium and around that area.
And as we said, the reaction times are not as fast as they could be because of a kind of inherently flawed situation behind them. So
Absolutely.
The final kind of comment is, and I know what your answer is going to be, but when we talk about we talked about at the top of the show the historiography of this, and you've explained about our collective understanding of the Luftwaffe at this time. It's a little bit simple compared to what it was actually doing. We have this very just ahead of the tank, simple kind of arrow-like view of the Blitzkrieg, when actually it's more complicated than that. And as we said, at least the Luftwaffe get talked about, because at this point, the RAF only get talked about in the fact that they're not there at all. And I guess you'd like that to change, and your book has done some good to help direct that, and what you're doing with teaching current serving RAF officers this kind of idea there. But clearly my question is going to be, are there more lessons we can be learning from this period that we're not?
I think for the modern day military, I think there are an awful lot of lessons that can be learned. When it comes to air-land integration, I think that getting together more often is hugely important, understanding each other, working together. But I also think just that basic understanding, I talked about different interpretations of control of the air. You can enter a meeting with somebody in the army in 1940 and sit down and say, we need to gain control of the air. Yep, absolutely agree with you. Brilliant. We can sack the rest of this meeting off. Let's have the rest of the day off. You're both walking out of there with 2 different concepts of what you're talking about.
What that actually means, yeah.
Absolutely. So I think there's a degree to that. I know that there's something called the Keys-Conningham project that the RAF and the Army are working on and have been working on for around about 8-9 years now, I think, to build more jointery into the military side of things in all of this, to get people sitting down, talking to each other, used to working together. But also I think we have to have senior military command that's more willing to work with the other services. I think that's where the big problem of integration lies, is that you have that inter-service rivalry at the top level when you're competing for influence, prestige, and most importantly, funding. And so you become more protective of your own service. So I think there's an awful lot that can be learned here. But as I said during the talk itself, that basic concepts like put headquarters together.
Yeah.
Basic things that we see. And as I said, I'm amazed when I've looked through the history of air-land integration, just how many times they come up with the revolutionary new concept of getting together, talking, having a chat.
And that's where I'm kind of feeling as much as I enjoyed the show I did with Ben Kite in the Battle of Britain, we're ending that about the lessons learned from the Battle of Britain. In a sense, the lessons learned from the Battle of Britain are in a separate field, whereas the Battle of France lessons are more connected to the Western Desert, to the 2nd Tactical Air Force. That's more of a linear because that is where it is all air and ground. Because the Battle of Britain, for all its excitement, the army has a negligible role in that at all. Whereas the other ones that is talked about, the North Africa, the Mediterranean, Malta, and the Far East, I guess, as well, there's much more of a ground, air, and indeed navy in the Mediterranean. So the Battle of Britain is more Battle of France is more part of that study, and the Battle of Britain in its own way is more of a separate study.
Yeah, it is almost a standalone case study in a single air superiority battle, whereas we can see, if you want to trace it from 1939 and look at air-land integration from the German perspective, Poland, France, and then go to the Western Desert, 41, 42, Monty and Conyngham, move that into Italy, move that into northwest Europe, across Germany, the Torch landings, the landings in Italy. So yeah, there is a real linear progression that we can see here, because once air power is invented in 1903, it can't be uninvented. And if you can control the skies, and I found it really interesting, you talking about speaking to soldiers on the ground who fought in Normandy, no bloody Air Force there, they weren't doing anything. Rommel writes exactly those letters in 1944, back to Berlin. Where's our Air Force? Yeah. I can't maneuver in the short day darkness hours that we've got in the summer. I can't maneuver in the daylight because I will get hit from the air. Where's my Air Force? They can't do anything because they've lost that control of the air.
Oh yeah, that's one of the paradoxes there, is that all the time the Allies are grumbling about a lack of Air Force. It's the one thing the Germans are grumbling about all the time. You look at anybody, the corps commanders, army commanders, divisional commanders, they're grumbling about air power all the time. If they can't bring their supplies up, they can't bring the logistics up, and yet the point of view from the Allies is that they're never doing anything at all, and that's the and again we will end things in a minute, but had the hierarchy listened to the Royal Air Force following the Battle of France in June 1940, they not only could have learnt what the RAF's feeling about it was, but the RAF would have maybe passed on more information about the strengths and weaknesses of the Luftwaffe as well, because they were the ones in seeing more of the Luftwaffe in how they operate. The army again are seeing an aspect of the Luftwaffe as well, but they're not seeing the broad picture. Again, they're seeing the kind of the cliche of the Stukas bearing down the beaches, but that's not necessarily giving an accurate vision of the Luftwaffe as a whole, a broad concept. So not only for the RAF's own role, but the RAF's understanding of the enemy role, all of that being not ignored, but dismissed, I suppose is a better way, in 1940 is unfortunate, I suppose, really, with the benefit of hindsight.
Absolutely, I'd agree with that, and it's I think my take on it is it's very much the army knowing air power, knowing what they want it to do, and they're not getting it, so they're going to throw their toys out of the pram. They do the same in the Western Desert, and Churchill has to intervene in the Western Desert and basically tell the army, stop it, the RAF are in charge.
I mean, the comment you made there about the saying that they should be there to be seen by the troops, I mean, that's completely dismissive of the range aircraft have. Even in 1940, when we know ranges aren't great, that's thinking of aviation very much in the string bag kind of 1918 kind of idea about them buzzing along at 60 miles an hour above your head. It shows a complete lack of foresight about. Clearly, even the writing on the wall in 1940 is that aviation is going to go on leaps and bounds. And if you're perceiving it in that way and you're an army commander, you've not seen the vision. You're blind to where aviation is going to go. You may not like this junior service, but if you can't recognize that where it's going to be, if you've come out of France and not seen the air power is going to be a big decisive factor of this, then you're a bloody idiot, frankly, aren't you?
I think so. I think Bartholomew's one of these old-fashioned officers. He'd liked the 1914 setup of the Royal Flying Corps, Royal Naval Air Service. But I think you have to read it at the strategic level. You have to look at the Bartholomew report as a political document.
Yeah.
This is a way of putting the boot in and really causing problems for the RAF. And if you can get some aircraft out of it, fantastic, brilliant. We can use them. From what I've seen, they don't know how to use them, but that doesn't really matter at this point. This is trying to blame somebody else. It wasn't our fault that we got kicked out at Dunkirk. No, RAF's fault. Don't look at us. Because that's the way I certainly read the Bartholomew report anyway.
Well, I think, I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you, Matthew, and I can say now you're going to get an invite to come back some point next year when we talk about the next stage of, I definitely do more things next year and acknowledging the anniversaries of the 1942 battle. So I might want to come and have you back on to talk about North Africa or the Mediterranean or some of that, because this understanding of the tactical side of things, how they're used at this operational doctrinal level, I think is something very interesting, because YouTube is flooded with the videos about the Spitfire compared to the Messerschmitt, or the Zero compared to the whatever it is, and that's fascinating. But to me, it's this use of them as at the higher level is much more key to understanding the victory of World War II than the rather tired and boring comparing aircraft, and that one can go faster, so it's better, the top trumps way. So if you'd like to come back and talk about some other stuff, that'd be great. So
be a pleasure.
Brilliant. Well, just remind people what we've got coming up, and I'll kind of say goodbye to you in a second. So folks, do not miss tomorrow's show. Same time, 7 p.m. UK. Professor Stephen Bourke is coming on from the USA to talk about the bombing of France in 1944. His book was a game changer to me about how he perceived the bombing of France and the American view of France. It's just, it'll blow your mind, that talk. Not that I'm saying tonight's and yesterday's talks haven't blown your mind as well, but that is a talk I'm particularly looking forward to doing tomorrow. And of course, we've got more things coming on. We've got John Moulin on Thursday. We've got some great stuff coming up. So keep tuned. Keep sharing what we're doing on Twitter. Consider becoming a patron if you wouldn't mind, to help me going into the future. Keep on doing this stuff there. The links to Matthew's book is in the description below. There's other ways you can find out more about the RAF in 1940. Contact me, contact him, contact them in Twitter, whatever, because there's more things you can learn about this period there. But right now, it remains me to say thank you very much, Dr. Matthew Powell, and have you enjoyed it?
It's been an absolute pleasure, Paul. It's been really good fun. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Well, I will invite you back again, and we'll talk about, say, North Africa or the Med or whatever you want to do. But right now, it remains me to say thank you very much, everybody, for watching. This is Paul Woodadge, World War II TV. I will see you all again tomorrow. Thanks very much. Bye.